Hey everybody, Steve back, and we're going to go over the i2M add-on and make a landscape. And it's real simple. You just install this, open it up, and hit append raycast. And the add-on will populate with all the primary features. You can come over here to the geometry nodes editor area, the property workspace, pin this because you'll have a few extra things in here as well, like the grid size. That's a pretty big deal. And what I will do is I'm just going to set the details to 0, and I'll set the scale to 0. So we end up with a flat plane to begin with. Now from here, it's real easy. And this is all proximity based. So if I jump into wireframe, you'll see what's going on here. Let me grab the actual plane itself. And I can populate the density and just bring that up and down. I can play around with the proximity, and everything that's in the folder for the repel is going to repel the instances here, which are currently just the grass mix, which is a generic grass model. So let's get in here and look at this. And you'll see right now I've got proxy set to on. If you turn it off, here's your grass. And so to get your grass where you want it, you come down here to the Euler or the random rotation, whichever one ends up working because of what you have switched on. And you can align all those pretty quick. And then we can bring up the detail just a touch on both of these. Something like that. Go over to the render side. I'll turn on scene world for sure, and let me unpin this workspace here, and we'll just go to the world properties, and we'll drop in a sky texture. The sky texture will populate, and then we can bring the exposure down. It's like some of your main features you're going to use the quickest are going to be what you see here. I'm going to come back over and kind of play around with the rotation here a little tiny bit more. Something like that looks pretty good. You can just mess around with it as you see fit. Yeah, so that's the standard rotation. If you want to switch it, it goes to the Euler rotation, and then you'll have to make the Euler adjustments here. But I've already got the rotation type set for this one, and it works good. So you can play around with those. It's got a 4D in here, so you can kind of change your landscape pretty instantaneously. And the proximity distance is pretty far away from my model, so I actually want to bring that proximity in just a touch. And if you're slow or lagging in the viewport, like you're over here in the render side, and you see how horrible that is, Control B, and just render a region out. But you'll notice that's still really laggy, and that's why I put the proxies on and off right here. So now you're going to use proxy instances instead. And I think you're like at least 30 minutes, an hour, and who knows, maybe a day ahead using an add-on rather than creating all of this just on your own. And so as you bring the rock up, maybe you scale this rock because this is the rock you've always wanted in your scene. The instances are going to move around with it, maybe a little bit harder to see. But everything adjusts on the terrain. The proximity is also adjusted on the terrain. So if you were to change any of the settings here and play around with the scale and how this looks, it'll all change on the fly for you. So that's the design. And then Control-Alt-B will take you back out of that because you don't really need that with my add-on. There's no reason to have that. You just have the proxies on and off unless you've got a very slow PC. Then the render region is going to be very helpful. And if you want, you could change the proxy type to bounding box. Since we got all these little things out here, whatever makes sense for you, you can do that. There's also materials, and we have instances 1 and 2, which you can switch off, on and off. And then, whatever you dump in here is going to scatter along with it. So if I just went ahead and dropped in a little tiny icosphere, like something about like that, and I'll apply that scale, hit M, and I want to add this to the collection with the grass mix. Now you're going to get that inside of here as well, and they're going to individually repel each other for the most part also, so that they don't clip and you don't have like bad results, right? So that's the general idea here for the add-on, is that you could quickly prototype things out. This rock looks like trash coming in. It's just lower poly, it's a little broken up, so you could subdivide that before you go to do your render. So I could put this to like level 2 and turn it off, just knowing it's going to look good, or even 1, because 1 looked pretty good. And then you could subdivide the rock that comes in, or you could just do your own, because if you have extra objects enabled, you've got a rock generator right here. Okay, so all you have to do is go and enable your mesh extras. Let's see. And I'll probably have to type in extras or extra or something like that. Mesh extra objects, and that should be what pops in and populates that for you so you can work with it. And don't forget, the bounding box is good, but the convex hull is the one that gives you the absolute least geometry, technically, with the closest representation of whatever mesh you're working on. All right, so let's go back to the sky texture. Let's play around with this and pull the ozone up just a little bit. And you can follow along with this if you don't have the add-on. You could follow along to the point of at least setting up the sky texture, you know, and kind of getting a better idea. So the sun rotation is pretty important. I don't necessarily want this right behind my scene blaring in. Doesn't look good. And I don't want it necessarily right in front of it. So somewhere to the side, and whatever is going to end up looking better. And I think I'll go ahead and turn this on one time just so I can kind of see this a little bit better. And come back out. I'm going to pin the workspace and then right click in here so I don't see everything highlighted. And then kind of play around with this and populate it. And everything produces its own shadow, you know, as it's an instance of. So materials. So grass color does come in. Let me see if that's actually going to work, and we'll turn off the proxy. Okay, so that's the one here. So material 2 will control this, the grass texture, and then you could individually texture something if you throw it in, so it'll look good. You can just like have a little grass plane here that you can very, very quickly modify and change the entire scene and make it look like whatever you want. There we go, and I'm going to run the scale. The scale is going to chop it up really, really heavy, so 0.005 or something like that, or just hold shift and bring it up ever so slightly. It'll kind of break up the landscape for you and give you some more shadows. And then if you grab a rock and shift D and move it over, it's going to work with proximity as well. And then you can just rotate it on pretty much any access point you want. And let's come over here and see. Yeah, so it works good. Bring the density down just a touch, turn proxies back on. And not to be confused, the proximity is something different than the proxy. The proxy is actually called viewport, and that's a node. Whoa, come back here, i2M. All right, I thought I had the screen split, so I'm gonna do a split real quick. We'll look inside the geometry nodes, and I'll show you quickly how I actually achieved it. So the viewport is an actual node, and that's what causes the proxies to show up in the viewport, but they don't show up. Like, you're not turning your mesh into bounding box, you're not turning it into convex hull, you're turning it into viewport. So it's not going to be a convex when you render it, it's not going to be a bounding box when you render it. And so if I come over here, you'll still see the proxy, but what I'll do real quick is I'll pull up Light Magic Studio, and I'll just drop a camera in the scene and make it active. Let's bring that camera down just a touch. And let's find a spot here, right about there. That's pretty good. And so I'm gonna do some depth of field. So it automatically selects when you hit focus camera. I don't know, I'm not trying to make a plug for every add-on I've got, but you can see it's blurred everything else out except for down here. When you hit focus camera, it's going to grab the closest object in the scene that it can get, which was the rock, which is loose. And it puts depth of field on it, and then you can change the depth of field as you see fit. Control Alt C if you don't. Ooh, a little bit. There we go. So Control Alt C will move the camera in and out in the scene, and you'll see camera focal length pop up, so you can kind of change it. There's a myriad of other options here. I just want to throw that in the scene, and then kind of play around with the illumination just a touch. So now if I render this image, you'll see the grass and you'll see the depth of field leading up. Okay, and so that the i2M add-on does a lot. The Lightmagic Studio does a lot also, and it does even more now because I've added some special things to it. But just so you know, the is viewport does that, and it's pretty useful. And then, you know, you're just going to render out one particular spot. So even before you get like started too much, like this is the spot I want. So I think the X will work good. So I'd come over to the X, kind of bring that in just a touch, and then I can go to the Y and I can bring that in just a touch and save a lot of geometry that I don't really need. And if I really want to, I could just shrink the whole thing down, move the rocks around. But like that one spot was where the camera is facing. And that's good enough. And then you've got an instance scale over here as well. So you can kind of bring the instance scale up and kind of change how things look. You've got to pick instance. And of course, like I said, you got the proxy type, so it looks kind of crazy. But then you'll end up with something like this. Maybe you don't want to render your scene with too much terrain in it like that. And so just go ahead and click render again. And voila. You know, you got to texture everything else out. And just to make this look a little better, we could actually go in and add some materials. So I'll just choose some rock materials. It'll be something dark. It doesn't have to be anything too special. And I'm just using Blender Kit for this, so I can just dump some quick stuff on here. Make it nice and easy. And that one comes in apparently with a displacement. I'm not too crazy about that, so jump over to the shader editor and see if I can find it and adjust the actual displacement itself. That's a little crazy looking. Yeah, well, no big deal. Go to material for that. Let's unpin the workspace. I want to go down to settings, displacement and bump. I could do displacement only. See how that ends up looking. I don't like that texture, period. It's too dark for my scene anyways, so how about we just, nope, go away. I'll click on this one. Now I'm gonna click here, I'm gonna hit Control L, and I wanna link the materials so they share a material. And I think that's pretty good. And it looks like I don't actually have a material output for the main ground terrain. So for right now, I'll throw in a set material, and the set material can go right before the join geometry, so it pulls in the geo from this side because I've got set materials down here for all the instances, and then I can just find something, maybe type in something like dirt. Dirt sounds good. None of these really look good. I should be able to drop that here and then find dirt and drop dirt in there. Yeah, it doesn't look too good. Let's try some stylized dirt. That ought to be fun. Did it load? No, it's not loading. So if Blender Kit ever does this to you, you can come over here and find it in the end panel and hit the X. Because a lot of materials aren't working for Blender 3.6, the newest version, the stable release like I've got, and 4.0, it's not working at all. So dirt ground material, it's indicated by the fact that it shows a little green bar. That's going to be fine. Let's go to the shader editor, and I'll come back up here and find dirt ground material and go back and find this. And it's not really finished. That's a problem you'll see sometimes. I can map this and just tag it in and then put a texture coordinate in. And there we go. See, now you can see it. That's such a pain. I like that material, but it's like it's really difficult if you don't know what to do. So all I really did here was I connected the vector output of a mapping node to each one of the vectors of the images as they're all connected. So if that happens in Blender Market, you can very quickly just throw a texture coordinate in there. You can connect it to object. I like object because it kind of straightens everything out, and it seems like it almost straightens it out according to the terrain itself. And I believe, don't quote me, but I believe this is more procedural, not UV based. And so if you've got a mesh like this, I'm trying to point with that. If you've got a mesh that's procedural like this, you would want the texture to change with it and not be according to the UVs. Don't shoot me if I'm totally incorrect on that, but I believe that's the way it is. And so if I took up another view here, that's fine. I think I could literally just throw a house in. All right, so I'm going to come in and just drop in a very simple house. Doesn't necessarily have to even match what we're doing. And Blender Kit's pretty good for this. I really want this to be one piece so the proximity works. So I'm going to come to the house here, the folder, and click select objects. And I do have an active object, so I'm just going to hit Control J. And that should have joined everything. Looks like it did. And let's take up a top view. Bring this in, rotate it, scale it down, put it right there. I want to hit M and put this in to the repelling collection, so it will begin to repel. And the geo for the house is a little funky. It is working, but it's not like all the way down into the mesh. Like the rocks are going through, so no problem. I think we could just adjust the proximity out a touch because it's kind of dragging some of that in. And maybe the detail of the house, I'm sorry, of the terrain. Yeah, so that's what was hanging me up, was the actual terrain here. So you could play around with the proximity now. And let's throw a couple of, oops, don't hide, Alt H, come back. Something like that. And I think we could probably Control Alt 0 the camera here. And I'll just go ahead and render that. You can hit F12. I always go to the render button. It's just how it be for me. And so this is really cool. I don't like the lighting. I don't really like the whole setup yet, but I mean, you can play around with this. Obviously, this is not a tutorial for that. It's just the i2M, so you can prototype. And if I hadn't done this tutorial, I could have literally had all of this set up in about 3 minutes. So, you know, you can definitely step your game up when it comes to add-ons. But the depth of field, the light's kind of crisp and touching the top here. It looks good. All this is procedural. You can literally change everything. So yeah, you can go pick up the add-on on the Blender Market. It's there for download. Thanks for watching, guys. Smash that subscribe, smash that like on the way out. See you guys in the next tutorial.